like the way he presented his books. Over 70 years old, and he comes from Norway.
I don't know much about Roald Dahl, but I know a lot about his books.
Well, he's a terrific writer. I really like his writing.
He's a great author because I've got most of his books.
I was really surprised because some people say he's really cantankerous, but he was really nice and he's not mean at all.
He makes lots of children happy.
Oh, he's a nice man. He's a great storyteller.
To come and see Roald Dahl was a good experience for me.
Welcome to the wonderful world of Roald Dahl. This is one in a series of 4 programs recorded live at the Dallas Brooks Hall. We're sure that you'll enjoy watching and listening to Roald Dahl as much as you've enjoyed reading his books.
I've got one here which simply says, do something with chocolate. And I would guess you know what that is. So I'll read you something which might puzzle you a little bit, and it might not. Miranda, shouted Mr. Wonka. Don't go near it. Come back. It could be dangerous. Oh, shut up, you old goat, Miranda shouted back. I want some of this peanut brittle, and I'm going to have it. The next moment, the girl was slipping and sliding down the slippery chute and straight into the massive, steaming cauldron of molten peanut brittle. Save her, screamed Mrs. Piker. She'll be boiled alive, yelled Mr. Piker. Fish her out, Wonka. Do something, man. Don't just stand there grinning like an idiot. I beg you not to worry, dear Mr. Piker, Mr. Wonka said. She was a repulsive little child at the best of times. But soon, when she comes out, she'll be completely changed. She'll be sweet and crunchy, if she ever does come out. And over to one side, the Oompa Loompas were beating their drums and starting another song. Oh, Miranda Mary Piker, they sang. How could anybody like her? Such a rude and disobedient little kid. So we said, why don't we fix her in the peanut brittle mixer? Then we're sure to like her better than we did. Soon this child who was so vicious will have gotten quite delicious, and her parents will have surely understood that instead of saying, Miranda, oh, the beast, we cannot stand her, they'll be saying, oh, how crunchy and how good. Now then, you see, that's the end of that. I'll tell you. I'll tell you what it is. I'll tell you what it is. It's obviously something to do with Charlie, but when I first wrote Charlie, 25 years ago, something like that, I got so carried away with writing about disgusting and filthy little children, like Augustus Gloop and all the rest of them, that I put 17 or 18 of them in the book. And this was one of them. And when I read it through, the whole thing was... Actually, I read it through and didn't know. So I gave it to my nephew, who was called Nicky. And Nicky, who's now about 40, was then about 12. And I said, what do you think of that, Nicky? He said, I think it's rotten. It's boring. And you know you have to listen to that. So I went through it, and I slowly started taking out one child after the other until there were only 4 left, which was probably the right sort of balance. It looked like it, and that was all right. But this was one I dug out of the old file. I thought it would be fun to read it to you. One of the many disgusting children who were taken out of the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So now you have a secret, which other people don't know about. I will look for the next note, which says, I seem to get an echo when I speak louder, but I'll do it. It says, this is a more difficult one for you to guess. It says, still one of the father's stories that he told Danny, from Danny the Champion of the World. What would that be? You're right. There's a lot of clever children in here, I can see that. My God. So here's a little bit from it. Why shouldn't the bubbles go upward, Sophie asked. I will explain, said the BFG, but tell me first what name you was calling your frobscottle by. One is Coke, Sophie said, Another is Pepsi. There are lots of them. And the bubbles is all going up. They all go up, Sophie said. Catastrophe, cried the BFG. Upgoing bubbles is a catastrophe disastrophe. Will you please tell me why, Sophie said. If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain, said the BFG. But your brain is so full of bug whiffles, I doubt you will ever understand. I'll do my best, Sophie said patiently. Very well then. When you was drinking this cokey drink of yours, said the BFG, it is going straight down into your tummy. Is that right or is it left? It's right, Sophie said. And the bubbles is also going into your tummy, right or left? Right again, Sophie said. And the bubbles is fizzing upwards. Of course, Sophie said. Which means, said the BFG, that they will all come swish-whiffling up your throat and out of your mouth and make a foulsome, belchy burp. That's often true, Sophie said, but what's wrong with a little burp now and again? It's sort of fun. Burping is filthsome, the BFG said. Us giants is never doing it. But with your drink, Sophie said, what was it you called it? Frobscottle, said the BFG. With Frobscottle, Sophie said, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result. Why nasty? Asked the BFG, frowning. Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they'll be coming out somewhere else with an even louder and ruder noise. A whiz popper! A whiz popper, cried the BFG, beaming at her. Us giants is making whiz poppers all the time. Whiz popping is a sign of happiness. It is music in our ears. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz popping is forbidden among young human beings. It is considered extremely rude, Sophie said. But you is whiz-popping, is you not, now and again, asked the BFG. Oh, everyone's whiz-popping, if that's what you call it, Sophie said. But where I come from, it is not polite to talk about it. Redunculous, said the BFG. If everyone is making whiz-poppers, then why not talk about it? We is now having a swiggle of this delicious Frobscottle, and you will see the happy result. The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous gurgling swig. It's glummy, he cried. I love it. For a few moments, the big friendly giant stood quite still. A look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then suddenly, the heavens opened and he let fly with a series of the loudest and rudest noises Sophie had ever heard in her life. They reverberated around the walls of the cave like thunder, and the glass jars rattled on their shelves. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the enormous giant clean off his feet like a rocket. Whoopee, he cried when he came down to earth again. Now that is whiz-popping for you. Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help it. Have some yourself, cried the BFG, tipping the neck of the enormous bottle towards her. Don't you have a cup? Sophie said. No cups, only bottle. Sophie opened her mouth, and very gently the BFG tipped a little forward, the bottle forward, and poured some of the fabulous Frobscottle down her throat. Oh, gosh, how delicious it was. It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream with just a trace of strawberries on the edge of the flavor. And the bubbles were wonderful. Sophie could actually feel them bouncing and bursting all around her tummy. It was an amazing sensation. It felt as though hundreds of tiny people were dancing a jig inside her and tickling her with their toes. It was lovely. It's lovely, she cried. Just wait, said the BFG, flapping his ears. Sophie could feel the bubbles traveling lower and lower down her tummy. And then suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she too made the walls of the cavern ring with the sound of music and thunder. Bravo, shouted the BFG, waving the bottle. You is very good for a beginner. Let's have some more. I'll tell you something funny on that subject. Well, everything to me is funny on that subject. But something that perhaps you didn't know, that in the 19th century, in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, a very famous Italian music hall comedian came to London, and he was called Signor Tagliatelle. And his act on the stage was so fantastic, and it made people laugh so much that they actually had Red Cross nurses around the music hall to help people who collapsed with hysterical laughter. And you know what he did? He had complete control of himself in that region, and he could do it whenever he wanted to, and he stood up there and could actually play God Save the Queen with Wiz Poppers. And I'll tell you something, if he was here and you heard him, you'd collapse with laughter too. He was famous. Here we are. Now then, I've got a revolting rhyme here, but you can have any one you like, actually. If you shout which one you want, I will try to see which one you want most. All right. Well, I heard it very clearly, and it's Jack and the Beanstalk, because it's the only one I've got here. Jack's mother said, "We're stony broke. Go out and find some wealthy bloke who'll buy our cow. Just say she's sound and worth at least £100. But don't you dare to let him know that she's as old as Billy-O." Jack led the old brown cow away and came back later in the day and said, "Oh, Mumsy dear, guess what your clever little boy has got? I really don't know how, a super trade-in for our cow." The mother said, "You little creep, I'll bet you sold her much too cheap." When Jack produced one lousy bean, his startled mother, turning green, leapt high up in the air and cried, "I'm absolutely stupefied. You crazy boy, do you really mean you sold our Daisy for a bean?" She snatched the bean, she yelled, "You chump," and flung it on the rubbish dump. Then, summoning up all her power, she beat the boy for half an hour, using, and nothing could be meaner, the handle of a vacuum cleaner. At 10 p.m. or thereabout, the little bean began to sprout. By morning it had grown so tall you couldn't see the top at all. Young Jack cried, "Mum, admit it now. It's better than the rotten cow." The mother said, "You lunatic, where are the beans that I can pick? There's not one bean, it's bare as bare." "No, no," cried Jack, "you look up there. Look very high, and you'll behold each single leaf is solid gold." By gollikins, the boy was right. Now glistening in the morning light, the mother actually perceives a mass of lovely golden leaves. She yells out loud, "My sainted souls, I'll sell the mini by a rolls. Don't stand and gape, you little clot. Get up there quick and grab the lot." Jack was nimble, Jack was keen. He scrambled up the mighty bean. Up he went without a stop, but just as he got near the top, a ghastly, frightening thing occurred. Not far above his head he heard a big, deep voice, a rumbling thing that made the very heavens ring. It shouted loud, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman." Jack was frightened, Jack was quick, and down he climbed in half a tick. "Oh, Mum," he gasped, "believe you me, there's something nasty up our tree." "I saw him, Mum, my gizzard froze, a giant with a clever nose." "A clever nose?" his mother hissed. "You must be going round the twist." "He smelled me out, I swear it, Mum. He said he smelled an Englishman." The mother said, "And well he might. I've told you every single night to take a bath because you smell, but would you do it, would you hell? You even make your mother shrink because of your unholy stink." Jack answered, "Well, if you're so clean, why don't you climb the crazy bean?" The mother cried, "By gad, I will. There's life within the old dog still." She hitched her skirts above her knee and disappeared right up the tree. Now, Would the giant smell his mum? Jack listened for the fee-fo-fum. He gazed aloft. He wondered when the dreaded words would come. And then, from somewhere high above the ground, there came a frightful crunching sound. He heard the giant mutter twice, "By gosh, that tasted very nice. Although," and this in grumpy tones, "I wish there weren't so many bones." "By Christopher," Jack cried, "by gum, the giant's eaten up my mum. He smelled her out, she's in his belly. I had a hunch that she was smelly." Jack stood there gazing longingly upon the huge and golden tree. He murmured softly, "Golly gosh, I guess I'll have to take a wash if I'm going to climb this tree without the giant smelling me. In fact, a bath's my only hope." He rushed indoors and grabbed the soap. He scrubbed his body everywhere. He even washed and rinsed his hair. He did his teeth, he blew his nose, and went out smelling like a rose. Once more he climbed the mighty bean. The giant sat there, gross, obscene, muttering through his vicious teeth, while Jack sat tensely just beneath, muttering loud, fee-fi-fo-fum. "Right now I can't smell anyone." Jack waited till the giant slept. Then out along the boughs he crept and gathered so much gold, I swear, he was an instant millionaire. "A bath," he said, "does seem to pay. I'm going to have one every day." So there we are. Now, there's nothing in this book about the next one, because it wasn't an idea. It's true, the next one, so there's nothing in the book. But while I've got the book here, there are all sorts of funny sections in it. And there's one labeled Curious and Little Known Facts. And every time I find one, I write it down, because you never know when it'll be useful. They are, they're just curious and interesting. Birds have a powerful vision towards red, but not to blue, and almost no sense of smell. Their flowers are mostly red, therefore, sometimes yellow. It's very interesting. Here we have an interesting one. It's almost back to the BFG. A group of scientists in the University of California have spent 5 years tracking down the elusive substance in the baked bean that causes farting. Heinz, the makers of the baked bean, have apparently offered vast sums to the person who can develop a bean without this curious characteristic. So far, the scientists have discovered the substance itself, which is called raffinose oligosaccharide. But how to grow a bean that doesn't have it is a problem that they haven't yet solved. Now, isn't that interesting? A guppy. Now, I think I've used this one somewhere, and maybe you know where I used it. So I do pick them out and use them sometimes. A guppy's first approach to mating is to bite the rear end of the other fish. Something I haven't tried myself yet, but now, which book did I use that in? I only know, I'll tell you how I only know, because I was giving an interview in Sydney 2 days ago to a very brainy librarian and a very brainy girl who was with her, taping it. And I read it out, and they both said, "Oh, yes, you used that in Danny." And I must have done, but I'm not sure where. I know I did. There we are. I love this one, and I haven't used it yet. The little yellow clover butterfly often carries his wife around on his back. I haven't tried that one either yet. But isn't it lovely? Now then, let's find another. The 5 of us stood up and left the room. We didn't speak as we made our way down the long corridor into the headmaster's private quarters, where the dreaded study was situated. Thwaites knocked on the door. I might explain or remind you here that we were all about 6 years old, no more. Enter. We sidled in. The room smelled of leather and tobacco. Mr. Coombs was standing in the middle of it, dominating everything, a giant of a man if ever there was one. And in his hands he held a long yellow cane, which curved round the top like a walking stick. I don't want any lies, he said. I know very well you did it, and you were all in it together. Line up over there against the bookcase. We lined up, Thwaites in front, and I, for some reason, at the very back. I was last in the line. You, Mr. Coombs said, pointing the cane at Thwaites, come over here. This is also, I can remind you, in 1922, which is a very long time ago. Thwaites went forward very slowly. Bend over, Mr. Coombs said. Thwaites bent over. Our eyes were riveted on him. We were hypnotized by it all. We knew, of course, that boys got the cane now and again, but we'd never heard of anyone being made to watch. Tighter, boy, tighter, Mr. Coombs snapped out. Touch the ground. Thwaites touched the carpet with the tips of his fingers. Mr. Coombs stood back and took up a firm stance with his eggs well apart. I thought how small Thwaites' bottom looked and how very tight it was. Mr. Coombs had his eyes focused squarely upon it. You know, thinking of that later and picturing it back again, I didn't write it here, and remembering Mr. Coombs taking up this firm stance with his feet firmly wide apart, reminds me today of a very good golfer who's going to hit an enormously long drive, and he stands there and he settles himself down with his feet on the ground and gets all ready for a really hard one. Anyway, there was Mr. Coombs. Mr. Coombs, he raised the cane high above his shoulder, and as he brought it down, it made a loud swishing sound, and then there was a crack like a pistol shot as it struck Thwaites' bottom. Little Thwaites seemed to lift about a foot into the air, and he yelled, "Oh!" and straightened up like elastic. "Order!" shrieked a voice from over in the corner. Now it was our turn to jump. We looked round, and there, sitting in one of Mr. Coombs's big leather armchairs, was the tiny, loathsome figure of Mrs. Pratchett. She was bounding up and down with excitement. "Lay it into him," she was shrieking. "Let him have it. Teach him a lesson." "Get down, boy," Mr. Coombs ordered, "and stay down. You get an extra one every time you straighten up." "That's telling him," shrieked Mrs. Pratchett. "That's telling the little blighter." I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It was like some awful pantomime. The violence was bad enough, and being made to watch it was even worse. But Mrs. Pratchett, in the audience, the whole thing became a nightmare. Swish, crack went the cane. "Ow!" yelled Thwaites. "Order!" shrieked Mrs. Pratchett. "Stitch him up! Stitch him up! Make it sting! Tickle him up good and proper, headmaster. Warm his backside for him. Go on, warm it up." Thwaites received 4 strokes, and by gum, they were 4 real whoppers. "Next!" snapped Mr. Coombs. Thwaites came hopping past us on his toes, clutching his bottom with both hands and yelling, "Ow! Ouch! Ouch! Ow!" With tremendous reluctance, the next boy sidled forward to his fate. I stood there wishing I hadn't been last in the line. Watching it and waiting was probably even a greater torture than the event itself. Mr. Coombs's performance the second time was the same as the first. So was Mrs. Pratchett's. She kept up her screeching all the way through, exhorting Mr. Coombs to greater and still greater efforts. And the awful thing was that he seemed to be responding to her cries. He was like an athlete who is spurred on by the shouts of the crowd in the stands. Whether this was true or not, I was sure of one thing: he wasn't weakening. My own turn came at last. My mind was swimming and my eyes had gone all blurry as I went forward to bend over. I can remember wishing my mother would suddenly come bursting into the room shouting, "Stop! How dare you do that to my son?" But she didn't. All I heard was Mrs. Pratchett's dreadful, high-pitched voice behind me screeching, "This one's the cheekiest of the bloomin' lot, headmaster. Make sure you let him have it good and strong." Mr. Coombs, he did just that. As the first stroke landed and the pistol crack sounded, I was thrown forward so violently that if my fingers hadn't been touching the carpet, I think I would have fallen flat on my face. As it was, I was able to catch myself on the palms of my hands and keep my balance. At first I heard only the crack and felt absolutely nothing at all. But a fraction of a second later, the burning sting that flooded across my buttocks was so terrific that all I could do was gasp. I gave a great gushing gasp that emptied my lungs of every breath of air that was in them. It felt, I promise you, as though someone had laid a red-hot poker against my flesh and was pressing down on it hard. The second stroke was worse than the first, and this was probably because Mr. Coombs was well practiced and had a splendid aim. He was able, so it seemed, to land the second one almost exactly across the narrow line where the first one had struck. It is bad enough when the cane lands on fresh skin, but when it comes down on bruised and wounded flesh, the agony is terrible. The third one seemed even worse than the second. Whether or not the wily Mr. Coombs had chalked the cane beforehand and then thus made an aiming mark on my grey flannel shorts after the first stroke, I do not know. I'm inclined to doubt it, because he must have known that this was a practice much frowned upon by headmasters in general in those days. It was not only regarded as unsporting, it was also an admission that you were not an expert at the job. By the time the fourth stroke was delivered, my entire backside seemed to be going up in flames. Far away in the distance, I heard Mr. Coombs' voice saying, "Now get out." As I limped across the study, clutching my buttocks hard with both hands, a cackling sound came from the armchair over in the corner. And then I heard the vinegary voice of Mrs. Pratchett saying, "I am much obliged to you, Headmaster, very much obliged. I don't think we is going to see any more stinking mice in my gobstoppers from now on." So that's the end of that one.